In the late 19th century, the conflict between science and religion had reached a pitch of mutual hostility that made nuanced positions nearly impossible to maintain. On one side stood the scientific naturalists, confident that the expanding empire of physics and biology would eventually explain everything, leaving no room for soul, God, or spiritual experience except as brain chemistry. On the other side stood religious defenders who felt their entire world threatened and often responded with a fundamentalism that rejected scientific findings wholesale. William James refused both positions. He found them both intellectually dishonest and psychologically impoverished, and he spent much of his career developing a third way. James's strategy was empirical. He proposed treating religious and spiritual experience the way a scientist treats any natural phenomenon, with careful observation, rigorous description, suspension of premature theoretical judgment, and openness to whatever the evidence actually shows. This was the project of the Varieties of Religious Experience, delivered as lectures at Edinburgh in 1901 and 1902 and published to enormous international response. His starting point was the experience itself, not the doctrines, not the institutional structures, not the theological arguments, but the raw, first-person experience of feeling oneself in the presence of the divine, or of something larger than the ordinary self, or of a peace that surpassed ordinary explanation. These experiences, James argued, were the foundation of all religion. Doctrines are the second-order interpretations that communities build around primary experiences. Institutions are the third-order structures that communities build around doctrines. If you want to understand religion psychologically, start with the experience. What he found when he examined these experiences was that they were real. Not real in the sense of being caused by supernatural agents. James was careful to suspend judgment on that question. But real in the sense that they happened, that they changed people, that they produced genuine psychological transformations that could be documented and compared across cultures. People who had them described them in remarkably similar terms despite wildly different theological contexts. They described them as more real than ordinary experience, not less. They described lasting consequences, new values, new capacities for love and forgiveness, release from habits that had been unbreakable. James argued that science, properly understood, had no grounds for dismissing these experiences. Science can tell us about the neural correlates of spiritual states. It can identify physiological changes that accompany them. It can trace their effects on behavior and health. What science cannot do, what it has no method for, is evaluate the significance of the experience from the inside. The question of what a mystical state means to the person having it is not a question that brain scans can answer. At the same time, James was equally firm that religious experience is not self-validating. The intensity of a spiritual state is not evidence of its truth content. Delusion can be intense. Hallucination can be vivid. A mystical experience proves that something happened in the experiencer's mind. It does not by itself prove what caused it or what metaphysical claims are justified by it. James called the move from this experience happened and transformed me to therefore God exists in the way my tradition describes an overbelief, a further step beyond what the evidence strictly requires. Overbelief is not irrational, James insisted. Given that the experience is genuine, that it has real consequences, that it connects the person to something that feels like a larger reality, it is entirely reasonable to develop beliefs that make sense of it. The religious person is not doing something intellectually shameful when they conclude that their experience reflects genuine contact with something beyond the ordinary self. They are doing exactly what any rational person does when they interpret evidence. The question is only whether they hold their interpretation with the appropriate degree of tentativeness. The science-religion conflict, James thought, was largely a product of both sides claiming more than their evidence warranted. The scientific naturalist who says spiritual experience is nothing but brain activity has made a philosophical claim that goes far beyond what neuroscience can establish. The religious dogmatist who says my tradition's theology is certainly correct has made a claim that goes far beyond what any spiritual experience can verify. Both are overbeliefs. The honest person holds both their scientific conclusions and their religious commitments with something like humility. James's own position was subtly theistic. He was personally drawn to the idea that what mystical experiences contact might be real, that the more that mystics describe might correspond to genuine features of the universe beyond what ordinary consciousness accesses. He called this hypothesis of a wider self, the possibility that human consciousness is not entirely closed in on itself but opens, at its margins, into something larger. He held this hypothesis tentatively, as a scientist holds a promising but unproven theory. For the modern person trying to navigate between a secular world that often dismisses spiritual experience and a religious culture that sometimes demands uncritical belief, James offers a genuinely useful framework. Take your experience seriously. Subject it to honest scrutiny. Form beliefs proportionate to your evidence. Hold them with appropriate humility. And recognize that both the person who has never had a spiritual experience and the person who has a looking at the same universe from different windows. Subscribe to The Psychology of William James to explore more of his timeless ideas.